The Texas sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the cracked desert floor into a furnace that seemed to leach the very life from everything it touched. Elise Barrett stumbled forward across the burning sand, her 5-year-old son Thomas burning with fever in her arms, while her 7-year-old daughter Mary dragged behind them, her small feet bloody and raw from 3 days of desperate flight. The acrid taste of smoke still lingered in Elise's mouth, and the stench of death clung to her torn dress like a shroud she could never remove. The memory of that first terrible morning played in endless, torturous loops through her mind. She could still hear James's voice, calling out a warning as the riders appeared on the horizon, 12 men painted in crude red and yellow streaks, wearing stolen Comanche war bonnets, and carrying tomahawks that gleamed wickedly in the early light. But even in those first moments of terror, something had felt wrong about the attack. Indians. Someone had screamed from the wagon train, and chaos had erupted instantly among the 23 souls who had been traveling together toward the promise of California. Men scrambled for their rifles, while women gathered children close. But the attackers moved with a coordination that spoke of military training rather than tribal warfare. The leader had ridden straight for their wagon, a scarred brute with a missing ear and eyes like chips of winter ice. His war paint was crude and hastily applied, and when he shouted orders to his men, his voice carried the harsh accent of the Tennessee mountains rather than the flowing cadences Elise had heard described of Comanche speech. "Kill the men first," he had bellowed, his scarred face twisted with ugly pleasure. "We need the women and goods intact for the mining camps." That's when James had grabbed his rifle, shoving Elise behind their wagon with desperate strength. "Take the children and run," he had yelled, but before she could move, before she could even process what was happening, and the scarred man's pistol had cracked like thunder. The sound seemed to stretch forever in Elise's memory, followed by the wet thud of her husband's body hitting the ground. James had looked at her with eyes full of love and regret, his mouth forming words she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears, before the light faded and left her staring at a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Get Barrett's woman." The leader she had heard another rider call him Keller had shouted to his companions. "She's young and strong. Roy, help me corner her before she runs." A younger man with similar features and the same cold eyes had spurred his horse toward their overturned wagon. "What about the children, brother? Take them too. Healthy young ones fetch good prices at the mining operations. Army don't ask questions about where workers come from long as the quotas get filled." That's when understanding had crashed over Elise like ice water. These weren't Comanche warriors at all, but white men wearing stolen paint and feathers, using the disguise to raid settlements while directing blame toward the tribes. And they weren't just after supplies, they were slavers planning to sell survivors to the brutal mining operations that operated beyond the reach of law in the deep territories. She had grabbed Thomas and Mary, diving into the thick mesquite brush that bordered their camping spot, just as Keller's rope whistled through the air where her head had been. Thorns tore at her dress and skin as she crawled deeper into the undergrowth, one hand clamped over Thomas's mouth while she held Mary close with the other. For what felt like hours, she had crouched in that thorny hell, listening to the systematic slaughter of everyone she had traveled with for the past 2 months. Mrs. Henderson's scream cut short by a gunshot. Old Pete's defiant curses turning to groans, and then silence. The Wagner children crying for their parents until those voices too were silenced forever. "Find the school teacher." Keller's voice had carried clearly through the smoke and carnage. "She got a good look at our faces. Can't have her reaching Fort Griffin with descriptions." "What about the others?" Roy had asked, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made Elise's skin crawl. "They kill them all. Make it look like a proper Comanche massacre. Scalp the men, take some horses for show. Army'll blame the tribes and double patrols in Comanche territory. That'll give us clear hunting for the next 6 months. And if they send scouts looking for survivors, they won't find any. Desert'll take care of the Barrett woman and her brats if we don't catch them first." They had searched for hours, poking through the brush with rifle barrels and setting small fires to flush out any hidden survivors. But the mesquite thicket was vast and thorny, and Elise had pulled her children deeper into its heart, ignoring the cuts and scrapes that painted her arms with blood. Only when the sounds of destruction faded and the fake raiders rode away, convinced their primary witness had escaped into the desert to die of thirst and exposure, had she dared to emerge. The sight that greeted her would haunt her nightmares forever. Bodies scattered like broken dolls among the burned wagons, scalped and mutilated, to support the lie that Comanche raiders had been responsible. James lay where he had fallen, his rifle still clutched in hands that would never again hold her or comfort their children. She had knelt beside him for precious minutes, memorizing his face and whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep before the practical needs of survival forced her to move. Now, 72 hours later, those same needs drove her forward across sand that felt like walking on hot coals. Thomas's small body radiated heat like a furnace, his breathing shallow and rapid, with the fever sickness that came from too much sun and too little water. Mary's lips were cracked and bleeding, her once bright blue eyes dulled with dehydration and exhaustion. Behind them, perhaps a mile back, she could hear the steady drumbeat of hoofbeats Keller and his men who had picked up their trail yesterday and pursued them with the relentless patience of wolves following wounded prey. "Mama," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above the buzz of flies that seemed to follow them everywhere. "I'm so thirsty it hurts." Elise's throat constricted around words she couldn't speak. The last drops of water from James's canteen had been consumed at dawn, and her own mouth felt packed with cotton. "Just a little farther, sweetheart." She managed, though she had no idea where they were going or how much farther they could possibly walk. Mary stumbled, her knees hitting the red dirt with a sound that made Elise's heart clench. "Mama, I can't. My feet hurt so bad I can't feel them anymore." Elise looked down at her daughter's feet and felt her remaining strength drain away, like water through a sieve. The child's shoes had worn through completely, leaving bloody blisters and deep cuts from the sharp stones and thorns. 7 years old, and she had walked 60 miles through hell without a single complaint until now. "I know, baby. I know it hurts." Elise knelt beside Mary, her own legs trembling with exhaustion. The landscape around them offered no mercy, endless stretches of scrub brush and jagged rock formations that provided no shelter from the blazing sun or concealment from pursuing eyes. In the distance, heat mirages shimmered like false promises of water, taunting them with phantom lakes that vanished when approached. The air itself seemed hostile, so dry it cracked her lips with each breath and made her nose bleed. Sweat evaporated before it could cool her skin, leaving behind salt crystals that stung her eyes and made every movement a lesson in pain. As she tried to summon strength that simply wasn't there anymore, a shadow fell across them. Elise looked up, expecting to see Keller's leering face and the muzzle of his pistol, but instead found herself staring at a figure that seemed carved from the desert itself. The man was tall and lean, his bronze skin weathered by decades of sun and wind, but unmarked by the crude paint that had decorated the false raiders. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest bare except for a necklace of carved bone and turquoise. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, which was streaked with premature silver at the temples. Most striking were his eyes, dark as obsidian, but filled with an intelligence that seemed to weigh and measure everything they touched. This was no painted imposter like Keller's men. This was a true Comanche warrior, and Elise felt her blood turn to ice despite the blazing heat. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like old leather. "Please don't hurt my children." The warrior studied them for a long moment, his gaze taking in Thomas's fevered face, Mary's bloody feet, and Elise's torn dress and sunburned skin. When he spoke, his English was accented, but precise, each word carefully chosen and weighed. "You run from bad men," he said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact delivered with quiet certainty. Elise blinked in surprise, hope flickering to life in her chest, like a candle in a windstorm. You've seen them. I have watched them hunt you like wolves hunt wounded deer. They are not Comanche, though they wear our paint. His jaw tightened with controlled anger that made the air around him seem to shimmer. They dishonor my people with their false faces and stolen feathers. The sound of distant gunshots echoed across the desert, closer now than before. Keller's voice carried on the wind, harsh and mocking. "Come out, little school teacher. You're only making this harder on yourself and those brats. We're going to find you eventually, and when we do, you'll wish you'd surrendered when you had the chance." The warrior's eyes hardened at the sound, and Elise saw his hand move instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "These men, they killed your husband?" "Yes." Elise whispered the words, scraping her throat raw. "And 21 others. They made it look like a Comanche raid, but they're white men. Slavers. They want to capture us and sell us to mining camps to keep us from identifying them to the authorities." Something flickered in the warrior's expression, a flash of old pain quickly suppressed, followed by something harder and more dangerous. "Your children will not survive another day in this heat. And you?" He studied her face with unsettling intensity. "You are already broken inside, but you fight still for them." The naked truth of his words hit Elise like a physical blow. She was broken, shattered by James's death, by the horror of watching friends and neighbors slaughtered, by the desperate knowledge that she was about to fail in the most fundamental duty of any mother, keeping her children alive. In that moment of absolute despair, with death approaching from behind and no hope ahead, Elise made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. She fell to her knees in the burning sand, looking up at the Comanche warrior with tears streaming down her face and leaving tracks in the dust that coated her skin. "Please save my children," she begged, her voice breaking like glass. "I'll do anything. I will become your woman and share your bed if you protect them from those men." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something deep and unreadable moved in his eyes, like shadows beneath still water. He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the approaching hoofbeats that grew louder with each passing second, and then shook his head slowly. "I do not want your body, white woman," he said, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of old sorrow and hard-won wisdom. "But I will ask something else of you, something that will test your spirit more than any physical sacrifice. Are you willing to risk everything to protect your children, even if it means turning against the ways of your own people?" Elise stared at him, confused by his refusal, but desperate enough to agree to anything. The thundering hooves grew louder, and she could hear Roy's voice now. "I see tracks heading toward that rock formation. They can't be far ahead." "Yes," she whispered without hesitation, clutching Thomas tighter as his fever made him shiver despite the heat. "Yes, I'll do anything." "Then pick up your children and follow me. Quickly. And remember, your promise will be tested before this day ends, and the price of breaking it may be higher than you can imagine." The warrior turned and began moving toward a narrow crevice in the rocky terrain that Elise hadn't even noticed hidden, as it was behind a screen of thorny brush and fallen stones. She struggled to her feet, lifting Thomas while urging Mary to hurry, her legs shaking with exhaustion, but somehow finding the strength to move. Behind them, the sound of horses grew thunderous, accompanied by the crash of brush being trampled, and the angry shouts of men who had tasted blood and wanted more. "Fan out, boys." Keller's voice boomed across the desert like the roar of some ancient predator. "She can't have gone far with those brats slowing her down. Check every crack and crevice. I want Barrett's head, and I want it before the sun sets." The crevice opened into a deeper ravine, then appeared from above its walls, carved smooth by countless flash floods over the centuries. The warrior, she still didn't know his name, moved with sure-footed grace across the rocky bottom, never looking back to see if they were following. His knowledge of the terrain was absolute. Every step seemed calculated to provide maximum concealment, while maintaining escape routes that only someone who had lived here for decades could know. Elise stumbled behind him, her legs shaking with exhaustion and her lungs burning from the dry air. But somehow she kept moving. The narrow walls provided blessed shade and concealment. But she could hear the bounty hunters above, their voices growing closer as they spread out to search every possible hiding place. "This way looks promising." Roy called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Fresh tracks in the sand here and blood drops on the rocks. Check every crack and crevice." Keller snarled in response. "They're down there somewhere, and I'm not leaving this desert without Barrett's head. She's the only one who can identify us to the army, and I'll be damned if I let some schoolteacher be the reason we all hang." As they picked their way around a bend in the ravine, Elise found the courage to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping us?" I thought. She trailed off, not wanting to voice the stories she'd heard about what happened to white captives. The warrior glanced back at her, his painted face unreadable in the shadows. "Because I have seen what happens when innocent people are left to die. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." He paused, listening to the sounds above, with the alert stillness of a predator. "And because those men dishonor my people by wearing our paint while they commit murder." "What's your name?" Mary asked, suddenly, her young voice carrying in the narrow space despite her exhaustion. The warrior stopped and turned to face them fully. And for the first time, Elise saw something approaching warmth in his dark eyes. "I am called Tacoda. It means friend to all in my language, though I have not always lived up to that name. I'm Mary, and this is Thomas," she said with the fearless honesty of childhood, gesturing to her fevered brother. "He's really sick. Can you help make him better?" Something softened in Tacoda's expression as he looked at the girl's earnest face, dirt-streaked and sunburned, but still full of trust. "I will try, little one. But first we must reach safety, and that requires silence from all of us." A gunshot cracked overhead, and chips of rock showered down on them like hail. One of the bounty hunters had spotted their trail and was trying to flush them out with rifle fire. Tacoda immediately flattened himself against the ravine wall, motioning for Elise to do the same with quick, economical gestures. "Stay here with the children," he whispered, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade was polished steel with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. "Keep them quiet, no matter what you hear." Before she could protest, he was gone, scaling the ravine wall with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. Elise pressed herself against the cool stone, holding Thomas close and placing a hand over his mouth to muffle his labored breathing. Mary crouched beside her, eyes wide with fear but silent as instructed. Above them she could hear the sounds of a brief but violent struggle, grunts of effort and the scrape of boots on rock, a man's cry of pain and surprise that cut off abruptly. Then came the thunder of hoofbeats as someone rode away at full gallop. Von Keller's voice bellowed from a distance, filled with rage and concern. "Roy, what happened? Where are you?" "Indian." Roy's voice came from much farther away, high with pain and fear. "There's a damn Indian with them. Cut me bad across the ribs. I'm bleeding like a stuck pig." "How many?" Keller demanded. "Just one, but he fights like 10. We need more men, brother. This ain't just some lost school teacher anymore." Tacoda reappeared at the edge of the ravine, his knife bloodied, but his expression calm and controlled. "One of them is wounded and has fled to bring reinforcements," he said as he dropped back down into the narrow space. "We must move deeper into the desert, where they will hesitate to follow. More men." Elise's voice rose in panic before she caught herself and forced it back to a whisper. "They cannot afford to let you live." Tacoda explained matter-of-factly. "You have seen their faces, know their crimes, understand their methods. They will bring their entire gang, perhaps 15 or 20 men, to ensure you never reach civilization to tell your story." As they continued through the winding ravine, climbing gradually higher into the rocky badlands, Elise studied the man who had saved them. There was something about his manner, a controlled sadness, that spoke of personal loss and hard-won wisdom. His movements were economical and precise, wasting no energy but maintaining constant alertness. "Why do you care about what happens to us?" she asked quietly as they paused to rest in a shaded alcove. "We're strangers, and white people have done terrible things to your people." Tacoda was quiet for several heartbeats, his dark eyes distant with memory. "Because wisdom comes from understanding that good and evil exist in all peoples. Because hatred is easy, but justice requires more courage than most men possess." The ravine began to climb more steeply, leading them higher into terrain that few men dared to venture. The heat was still crushing, but at least they were out of direct sunlight for most of the passage. Thomas's fever seemed to be worsening, though his small body shaking with chills despite the warmth, and his breathing had become more labored. "He needs water," Elise said desperately, touching her son's burning forehead. "And medicine. I don't know what to do for him." Tacoda stopped and knelt beside them, examining Thomas with practiced hands that were surprisingly gentle. From a pouch at his belt, he produced several items, herbs wrapped in small bundles, a piece of clean leather, and a small clay pot containing what looked like salve. "Your son has the fever sickness that comes from too much sun and too little water," he explained as he prepared a mixture of herbs with quick, sure movements. "This will help lower his temperature, but he needs rest and shade more than medicine." His movements were gentle and sure as he worked, and Elise found herself studying his hands. They were scarred from old wounds, knife cuts, burn marks, what looked like bite marks from some large animal. But there was no hesitation in them, no uncertainty. This was a man who had tended the sick and wounded before. "You've done this many times," she observed, watching him crush leaves between his fingers to release their medicinal oils. "I have," Tacoda replied, simply not looking up from his work. "In my village, I am sometimes called upon to heal as well as fight. The skills are not so different, both require understanding how the body works, how to help it recover from damage." As he applied the herbal mixture to Thomas's fevered brow, Mary watched with fascination. "Are you a medicine man?" she asked with the directness of childhood. "No, little one. Medicine men are trained from childhood in the old ways, taught by spirits and dreams, as much as by other men. I learned from necessity, from watching too many friends die when help came too late." His voice carried a weight of old sorrow. "Sometimes the living must learn to heal in order to honor the dead." The herbs seemed to have an immediate effect. Thomas's breathing eased slightly, and his skin felt cooler to the touch, despite the ambient heat. For the first time in days, Elise dared to hope that her son might survive this ordeal. Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay this kindness." "The debt is not yours alone," Tacoda replied cryptically, gathering his supplies with efficient movements. "But payment will come in understanding, not gold or goods." They found shelter as the sun reached its zenith in an abandoned mine shaft that tunneled deep into the hillside. The opening was partially concealed by fallen rocks and desert scrub invisible to casual observation, unless someone knew exactly where to look. Inside, the air was cooler, but stale, carrying the metallic scent of old ore. And something else. Something that made Elise's skin crawl with instinctive dread. "This place feels wrong," she murmured, holding her children closer as they settled into the shadows. Tacoda nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Many died here. White men driven mad by gold fever, working themselves to death in the heat and darkness, while their employers counted profits above ground. But the spirits of this place will not harm us. We seek only shelter, not riches that were bought with blood." As evening fell, they could hear Keller and his men searching the area above their voices, carrying through the thin desert air. The gang had indeed grown. Elise counted at least a dozen different voices, maybe more. Roy's report of an Indian protector had prompted Keller to recruit every available gun from the nearest settlements. Burn them out if you have to. Keller's voice echoed off the canyon walls like the roar of some ancient beast. I don't care if we have to torch half the territory that woman dies tonight, or we all hang when the army starts asking questions. What about the Indian? Someone called back. They kill him too. One less redskin to worry about, and it'll look better in our report. We were attacked while pursuing dangerous fugitives, had to defend ourselves. Tacoda had forbidden them from lighting a fire, knowing the smoke would give away their position instantly. In the darkness, with only the soft sound of breathing and the distant howl of coyotes, Elise found herself studying the man who had saved them. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as questions swirled through her mind. Why did you refuse my offer earlier? She asked quietly, not wanting to wake the children who had finally fallen into exhausted slumber. Tacoda was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old sorrow that made her chest tighten with sympathy. Because I learned long ago that desperation makes people promise things they cannot deliver. Because taking advantage of a woman's fear is the act of a coward, not a warrior. He shifted in the darkness, and she could sense rather than see his intense gaze. And because once long ago someone made me a similar offer out of desperation, and I was foolish enough to believe it came from the heart rather than from terror. What happened? She died keeping a promise she should never have been forced to make. He said simply, his words falling into the darkness like stones into a deep well. I will not repeat that mistake. Elise felt tears sting her eyes, though she had thought herself beyond crying. But you're asking for something in return. You said I would have to turn against my own people, not turn against them, but see them clearly. See what they have done to mine, and what mine have done in return. His voice grew harder, carrying the weight of accumulated grievances. Your people take our land, kill our buffalo, break promises made in treaty. They dress as Comanche to commit crimes, making my people hated for actions we did not take. If you want my protection, you must understand that not all white men are good, and not all Indians are savage. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had been raised on stories of savage Indians, had accepted without question the idea that all natives were threats to be eliminated or conquered. But this man, this Comanche warrior, had shown her more kindness and protection than any of the white men she had encountered since the attack. What exactly are you asking of me? When this is over, when your children are safe, you must promise never to speak against the Comanche people. You must teach your children that we are not monsters, but men and women who love our families and fight to protect our way of life. You must see us as human beings, not demons from your storybooks. It was a simple request on the surface, but Elise understood the depth of what he was asking. It meant abandoning everything she had been taught about Indians, rejecting the very foundation of the frontier mentality that had shaped her worldview. I promise, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The next morning brought new terrors. Smoke began to seep into the mine shaft as the rising sun revealed their general location to the searchers above. The acrid smell grew stronger by the minute, and soon they could hear the crackling of flames as Keller's men set fire to the dry brush around the ravine entrance. They mean to smoke us out like rabbits from a warren, Tacoda said grimly, gathering his weapons with quick, efficient movements. We cannot stay here, or the smoke will kill us more surely than their bullets. But if we go out there, Elise began, her voice tight with fear. If they will be waiting, he finished. But at least we will die fighting in clean air instead of choking to death in this hole like trapped animals. The exit from the mine shaft was a nightmare of smoke and flame. Burning branches fell around them as they climbed upward through the choking gray haze, and the heat was so intense that Elise felt her eyebrows singe and her skin blister from the radiant energy. The acrid smoke seared their lungs with every breath, making them cough and gasp for clean air that simply didn't exist. Thomas was barely conscious, his small body limp in her arms, while Mary coughed and sobbed from the smoke that burned her throat and eyes like acid. Behind them, the mine shaft was filling with choking gray clouds that would have killed them within minutes if they had remained. A bullet whined past Elise's ear close enough that she felt the heat of its passage and heard the distinctive crack of the projectile breaking the sound barrier. She looked up through the smoke to see Roy on horseback above them, his left arm wrapped in bloody bandages from Tacoda's knife work the day before, his face twisted with pain and rage. "There they are," he shouted, raising his rifle with his good arm. "Don't let them reach the high ground. Keller wants them alive if possible. But dead will do just fine." More shots rang out from different directions as the full scope of their predicament became clear. Keller had positioned men at every possible escape route, turning the ravine into a killing ground with overlapping fields of fire. They were climbing now, scrambling up a steep slope covered with loose rocks and burning brush, and their lungs searing with each breath of superheated air. Tacoda moved with deadly purpose, his bow and arrows claiming targets with lethal precision, despite the smoke and confusion. His first shot took a bounty hunter in the chest, the arrow punching through leather vest and rib cage to find the man's heart. The victim toppled from his horse with a scream that was cut short by the impact with the rocky ground. The second arrow found Roy's horse, the broadhead slicing through the animal's neck to sever major arteries. Both animal and rider went down in a tangle of screaming horseflesh and cursing man Roy's leg, pinned beneath his dying mount. But there were too many of them, and they were closing in from all sides with military precision that spoke of coordination and planning. "Mama!" Mary screamed as she lost her footing and began to slide backward toward the flames that were climbing the slope behind them. Without hesitation, Tacoda lunged forward and caught her, lifting her onto his back, despite the obvious pain it caused his wounded leg from yesterday's encounter. Blood was seeping through his buckskin leggings, darkening the leather, and leaving a trail that their pursuers could easily follow. A rifle cracked, and Tacoda grunted as a bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him partially around. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting the rocks beside him crimson. But he kept moving with grim determination, his jaw set against the pain. They reached a small plateau, just as the sun climbed fully above the horizon, its merciless light revealing the full scope of their desperate situation. Below them, the fire had created a wall of smoke and flame that would have been impassable even without the bounty hunters waiting on the other side. Behind them, more gunmen were climbing the slope, their shots growing more accurate as the distance closed. And directly ahead, the plateau ended in a sheer cliff that dropped 70 feet to the rocky canyon below, where vultures already circled in anticipation of carrion. "End of the line, schoolteacher." Keller's voice echoed from below as he and his remaining men emerged from the smoke like demons from hell. Elise counted 15 of them now, all armed and determined to finish what they had started 3 days ago. Tacoda set Mary down gently behind a large boulder near the cliff's edge. His breathing labored from the climb and blood loss. Dark stains were spreading across his buckskin shirt from multiple wounds, but his hands remained steady as he checked his bow and counted his remaining arrows. "Stay behind that rock," he told the children, his voice calm despite their desperate circumstances. "No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, do not move from there." Elise looked at the approaching men, and then at the cliff behind them, then at the wounded warrior who had risked everything to protect them. "There has to be another way," she whispered, desperation making her voice crack. "There is," Tacoda replied, knocking an arrow with practiced ease. "But it will require courage from both of us and luck from the spirits of this place." Roy had managed to free himself from his dead horse and was now climbing toward them on foot, his face twisted with rage and pain from his wounded arm and crushed leg. "You murdering redskin!" He snarled his voice, carrying clearly across the plateau. "I'm gonna gut you slow for what you did to me." Tacoda's response was immediate and lethal. His arrow took Roy through the throat, cutting off his threats with a wet gurgle. The man toppled backward, clawing at the shaft protruding from his neck, his rifle clattering uselessly down the rocky slope as his life's blood painted the stones beneath him. On Roy. Keller's bellow of rage echoed off the canyon walls like the roar of an enraged beast. "You bastard! That was my brother." The revelation hit Elise like a physical blow, pieces of overheard conversation from 3 days ago suddenly clicking into place. Brothers that explained the similar features she'd noticed during the original attack and the particular viciousness with which they'd pursued her across the desert. "Your brother was a murderer and a slaver." Tacoda called back his voice, carrying clearly across the battlefield. "He died as he lived without honor or courage." Keller's face went purple with fury, veins standing out on his forehead like twisted ropes. "Kill them all!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I want that Indian's scalp and the woman's head. Leave the children alive, they'll bring good prices at the mining camps." The battle that followed was unlike anything Elise had ever imagined. A desperate struggle for survival played out on a stage of stone and sand beneath the merciless Texas sun. Tacoda fought with the skill of a warrior, trained from childhood, his arrows finding targets with deadly precision despite his wounds and the chaos swirling around them. His third arrow took another bounty hunter in the leg, the broadhead slicing through muscle and bone to drop the man screaming to the ground. The fourth found its mark in someone's shoulder, spinning the target around but not dropping him completely. By Elise's desperate count, that left Tacoda with perhaps 3 arrows remaining against 13 determined killers. "Elise?" Tacoda said calmly, never taking his eyes off their attackers as they spread out to flank their position. "In the rocks near your feet, there is a gun." Roy dropped it when he fell. She looked down and saw the rifle lying among the loose stones, its metal surface glinting in the morning sun, like a promise of salvation or damnation. Her husband had taught her to shoot during their journey west, patient lessons around their evening campfire that had seemed like games at the time. "I don't know if I can kill a man," she whispered, her hands shaking as she picked up the weapon and checked its action as James had taught her. "You must," Tacoda replied, loosing another arrow that barely missed Keller's head and struck the rock behind him with a sharp crack. "For your children. For all the families these men will murder if they are allowed to escape." The rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands, but she forced herself to check the action and sight down the barrel. It was loaded and ready to fire. All she had to do was aim and pull the trigger to cross a line she had never imagined crossing. 2 bounty hunters broke cover simultaneously, charging up the slope from different directions with their faces twisted by bloodlust and greed. Tacoda's arrow took the first man in the chest, punching through his ribs to find his heart. But the second kept coming, his pistol raised and ready to fire at point-blank range. Elise raised the rifle with trembling hands, closed her eyes against the sight of the man's snarling face, and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward against the boulder, and when she opened her eyes, the attacker was on the ground, clutching his leg and screaming curses that would have made a sailor blush. "Good shot," Tacoda said grimly, though she could see the pain in his eyes, as another bullet found its mark in his uninjured shoulder, sending fresh blood streaming down his arm. But it was not enough. Keller and 11 of his men were still advancing their shots, growing more accurate as they closed the distance and found better cover among the rocks. The children huddled behind their boulder terror, etched on their small faces as bullets whined overhead and struck sparks from the stone around them. Smoke from the burning brush below was rising now, carried by the morning wind to obscure the battlefield in drifting gray clouds that made it difficult to see clearly. The acrid haze turned the fight into a deadly game of shadows and half-glimpsed movement, where death could come from any direction without warning. 3 more bounty hunters rushed their positions simultaneously, coming from different angles to overwhelm their defenses. Tacoda's arrow took the first man in the chest, but his bowstring snapped from the strain and heat, leaving him with only his knife against superior numbers. Elise tried to work the rifle's action for another shot, but the mechanism jammed on spent brass. With no time to clear it and no knowledge of how to do so quickly, she swung the weapon like a club, catching the second attacker across the face with the wooden stock. Blood erupted from his broken nose, but he didn't fall, raising his gun again with murder in his eyes. That's when the rocks began to fall. Whether it was the gunfire echoing off the cliff face or the heat from the fire below expanding the stone, something had loosened the cliff face above them. Stones the size of a man's head came bouncing down the slope, followed by larger boulders that struck with devastating force and thunderous crashes. One of the falling rocks caught the wounded bounty hunter in the head, dropping him instantly in a spray of blood and brain matter. Another boulder swept 2 more attackers off the plateau entirely, their screams echoing off the canyon walls as they plummeted toward the rocks 70 feet below. Rock slide. Someone shouted in panic. Get back before we're all killed." But Keller wasn't retreating. If anything, the danger seemed to fuel his rage and desperation. "I don't care if this whole mountain comes down," he bellowed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "That woman dies today, or we all hang tomorrow." He made his charge, then breaking from cover with his 8 remaining men, their guns blazing as they rushed the rock where Elise and her children huddled. Tacoda met them halfway, his broken bow abandoned in favor of the knife that flashed like lightning in the morning sun. What followed was brutal and desperate, a close-quarters melee, where skill mattered more than numbers. Tacoda's blade found one man's ribs, sliding between bones to pierce his lung. But the knife stuck in gristle and bone, and he had to abandon it as another attacker clubbed him with a rifle butt. Blood streamed from a gash on his head, but he kept fighting with bare hands and savage determination, using the rocky terrain and his intimate knowledge of close combat to even the odds. He caught one man's rifle barrel, twisting it aside as it fired, then drove his elbow into the attacker's throat with crushing force. Elise saw one of the remaining bounty hunters circling toward the children's hiding place, his intentions clear in his predatory grin. With her rifle still jammed and no other weapons available, she did the only thing she could think of. She began throwing rocks with desperate accuracy born of terror. Her first stone missed entirely, but the second caught the man in the temple, staggering him. The third and fourth strikes came in rapid succession, and though they didn't drop him completely, they bought precious seconds for her to position herself between him and her children. But Keller had seen her move. With a roar of triumph that was equal parts rage and vindication, he lunged past Tacoda's weakening guard and grabbed Thomas by his shirt, hauling the fever-weakened boy toward the cliff's edge with brutal efficiency. "That's enough," he snarled, pressing his pistol against Thomas's head hard enough to make the child whimper. "Everyone stops fighting right now, or the boy goes over the edge piece by piece." The battlefield fell silent, except for the sound of labored breathing and the distant crackle of flames. Tacoda froze mid-strike, his hand still raised to deliver a killing blow, while his remaining opponent backed away cautiously. That's better." Keller panted, his scarred face slick with sweat and blood from a cut above his eye. "Now here's what's going to happen." The Indian drops any weapons and steps back. "The woman comes with me nice and quiet. And maybe I let these brats live long enough to fetch a good price at the mining camps." "You're a liar," Elise said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins like liquid fire. "You killed everyone else without hesitation. You'll kill us too once you're done with your revenge." Keller's grip tightened on Thomas, making the boy whimper and struggle weakly. "Maybe so. But this way at least the boy dies quick instead of slow. Your choice, schoolteacher." That's when Elise noticed something that Keller, in his fury and desperation, had missed. Behind him, the cliff edge was crumbling from the rock slide, loose stones, and dirt cascading into the canyon below in a steady stream. The ground where he stood was no longer solid, and it was a shell of earth over empty air, held together by nothing more than tangled roots and compressed sand. She caught Tacoda's eye and saw understanding flicker in his dark gaze. A slight nod confirmed that he was ready for whatever desperate gambit she had in mind. But before she could act, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Well, well, look what we have here. Everyone turned to see a newcomer emerging from the smoke, a lean man with a full beard and military bearing, wearing the remnants of a Union Army uniform. Elise's blood turned to ice as she recognized him, even with the years and hard living that had changed his features. Sergeant Marcus Webb. She whispered the name falling from her lips like a curse. Keller's eyes widened with something approaching panic. Webb, what the hell are you doing here? Following old debts, Keller. Following promises made and broken. Webb's voice carried the weight of old grievances and fresh purpose. Hello, Elise. Been a long time since Fort Richardson. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Webb had been James's sergeant during the war, a man who had deserted his unit when faced with a particularly dangerous mission. James had reported the desertion, resulting in Webb's court-martial and dishonorable discharge. She had seen him once after the war, skulking around the edges of their wedding celebration with hatred burning in his eyes. You. She breathed understanding, flooding through her like poison. You were with them during the attack. You helped plan it. Planned it, lady, I suggested it. Webb's smile was cold and reptilian. When Keller told me about a wagon train with a certain schoolteacher and her family, I knew it was fate offering me a chance to settle old scores. Your husband cost me everything, my rank, my pension, my future. Only fitting that I return the favor. Tacoda's eyes had never left the crumbling cliff edge where Keller held Thomas. But Elise could see him processing this new information, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a veteran warrior. The boy. Webb continued, his voice conversational despite the guns and death surrounding them. He looks just like his father. Same weak chin, same frightened eyes. James always was a coward when it mattered. James was twice the man you'll ever be. Elise replied, anger beginning to override her fear. He died protecting his family. What have you ever protected except your own worthless skin? Webb's face darkened with rage. But before he could respond, Tacoda made his move. With the lightning reflexes that had kept him alive through countless battles, he dove toward Keller, not to attack, but to distract. The movement was enough to shift Keller's attention for a split second, his gun swinging toward this new threat. In that instant, Elise acted with the desperate strength of a mother whose child was in mortal danger. She launched herself at Keller with a scream that was barely human, her small fists striking his face and chest with surprising force born of pure maternal fury. The impact sent both of them stumbling toward the cliff's edge where the ground gave way, with a grinding roar of falling stone. Keller's scream of rage turned to terror as he realized what was happening, his hands clawing frantically for purchase on the crumbling earth. But Elise had wrapped her arms around Thomas, pulling him away from the precipice, even as she felt herself beginning to fall. Tacoda's hand clamped around her wrist, just as the ledge collapsed completely, leaving them hanging over the 70-foot drop. Below, Keller's screams echoed off the canyon walls until they were cut short by the sound of impact on stone. No, don't look down. Tacoda gasped, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he held their combined weight. Look at me, Elise. Trust me. With strength she didn't know she possessed, aided by Tacoda's careful coaching and the rough stone that provided handholds, Elise managed to climb back onto solid ground with Thomas clutched against her chest. The remaining bounty hunters, seeing their leader dead and their cause hopeless, began to retreat. All except Webb, who raised his rifle with murder in his eyes. If I can't have my revenge on James, he snarled, I'll settle for his family. The shot echoed across the plateau, but it was Webb who fell, an arrow protruding from his chest. Ayana stood 50 yards away, his bow still raised, having arrived with 3 other Comanche warriors, just in time to witness the climax of the battle. "Brother," Ayana called out in their native language, his voice carrying relief and concern in equal measure. Tacoda collapsed on the solid ground, blood seeping from multiple wounds, but alive and conscious. "The children," he whispered to Elise. "Are they safe?" Thomas and Mary were both crying, but unharmed, clinging to their mother, with desperate relief. Around them, the desert wind was already beginning to clear the smoke, revealing the full scope of the carnage that had taken place on this rocky plateau. "They're safe," Elise assured him, tearing strips from her already ruined dress to bind his wounds. "They're safe because of you." The journey to the Comanche village took 4 days with Tacoda, transported on a travois while he recovered from his wounds. During the trip, Ayana told Elise more about his brother's past, including the tragic story of his wife Sarah and their children. She was captured as a child during a raid. Ayana explained as they made camp beside a clear stream. "But she chose to stay with us when she reached womanhood, chose to marry my brother because she loved him. She understood, as you are learning, that families can be built from choice as well as blood." "What happened to her?" "Texas Rangers came to our village 2 winters past drunk and looking for trouble. They claimed they were searching for stolen cattle, but they wanted a fight. Sarah tried to shield her children when their horses ran wild through the camp." Ayana's voice was carefully controlled. "She and their son were trampled. Their daughter survived the initial injuries, but died 3 days later from fever sickness." Elise felt her throat constrict with sympathy. "I'm so sorry. My brother could have let hatred consume him after that. Many warriors would have declared war on all white people, sought revenge without regard for innocence or guilt. Instead, he chose to honor Sarah's memory by protecting travelers when he could, by showing that understanding between peoples was possible." The Comanche village was larger than Elise had expected, with nearly 300 people living in carefully arranged teepees along a river that provided fresh water and abundant fish. The people who came to greet them were curious, but not hostile, and several of the women immediately took charge of Thomas and Mary, providing them with food, clean clothes, and gentle medical attention. As she watched her children being welcomed into the community, Elise realized how completely her worldview had shifted. A week ago, she would have been terrified by the sight of painted warriors and traditional dress. Now she saw mothers fussing over 2 exhausted children, elders sharing stories by firelight, young people laughing and playing games that were universal to youth everywhere. Tacoda recovered slowly over the next month, his wounds healing cleanly, thanks to the medicine man's skill and his own remarkable constitution. During his convalescence, Elise found herself helping with the daily tasks of the village, her background as a teacher making her particularly valuable in caring for children and helping with basic medical needs. Thomas and Mary adapted with the resilience of youth, learning basic Comanche words and customs while maintaining their own cultural identity. Thomas became fascinated with the horses, spending hours watching the young men train their mounts with techniques passed down through generations. Mary showed an aptitude for the intricate beadwork that decorated clothing and ceremonial items. "They're happy here," Elise observed one evening as she sat beside Tacoda's bedroll watching her children play with Comanche youngsters in the firelight. "Children adapt because they have not yet learned to hate," he replied, his voice stronger now, but still carrying the weight of experience. "They see people, not enemies. En France d'armes. What happens when I take them back to white society? How do I explain what they've learned here without endangering this community?" Tacoda was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the stars visible through the teepee's smoke hole. "There is a trading post 3 days' ride west of here, run by a man named Murphy. He has a Comanche wife and treats all people fairly, white, Mexican, and Indian alike. He has been looking for a teacher for the children there, someone who can help them navigate both worlds. Both worlds. The old ways and the new, the traditions of their parents, and the skills they will need to survive in a changing land. Children of mixed heritage, children from different tribes, who have intermarried children of traders and settlers, who have learned to see beyond the color of skin. Elise considered the offer carefully. It would mean giving up any chance of reaching California, abandoning the dreams she and James had shared for their future. But those dreams belonged to a different woman, one who had not yet learned the lessons that had been carved into her soul by fire and blood. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you visit us there?" "When my duties permit, when the needs of my people allow it." His eyes found hers in the firelight. Sarah believed that families could be built from choice as well as blood, that understanding between peoples was not just possible, but necessary for survival. "If you are willing, I would be honored to be uncle to your children, to watch them grow and learn." "I would like that very much," Elise said softly. They need to know the man who saved them to understand that courage and kindness can come from any source. 6 weeks later, Elise stood in the doorway of the small schoolhouse at Murphy's trading post, watching her children play with a diverse group of youngsters from various backgrounds. The post sat at the intersection of several major trails, making it a natural meeting place for different cultures and communities seeking to trade goods, services, and ideas. Murphy himself was a grizzled veteran of the mountain man era, his weathered face marked by decades of frontier life, and his manners shaped by pragmatic acceptance of all peoples. His Comanche wife, Singing Bird, had become like a mother to Elise, helping her understand the delicate balance required to serve families from radically different backgrounds. The school served 28 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16, representing Mexican, Comanche, Cherokee, Apache, and white families who had settled in the area or passed through on trading expeditions. Elise taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic in English, while Singing Bird instructed them in traditional skills languages and the cultural knowledge that would help them navigate an increasingly complex world. The children learned that knowledge came in many forms and that wisdom could be found in unexpected places. They discovered that the mathematical concepts underlying Comanche horse trading were the same ones that governed Mexican silver mining and white banking. They learned that Cherokee agricultural techniques could improve white farming methods, and that European medical knowledge could enhance traditional healing practices. Thomas had grown strong and healthy, his fever sickness nothing but a memory replaced by robust good health and insatiable curiosity. He could now speak 4 languages fluently and served as a translator for newer students, his natural diplomatic skills making him a bridge between different cultural groups. Mary had developed into a skilled artist, her beadwork rivaling that of women twice her age, and she helped teach younger children the patience and precision required for detailed crafts. Her artistic eye also proved valuable in illustrating lessons, creating visual aids that helped students from different linguistic backgrounds understand complex concepts. On this particular afternoon, 6 months after their arrival at the trading post, Elise heard a familiar voice calling her name. She turned to see Tacoda approaching on horseback, his wounds fully healed and his bearing proud and strong once again. Behind him rode 2 other Comanche warriors she recognized from the village. Uncle Tacoda. Mary ran to him using the title they had adopted at his suggestion and the tribe's approval. He dismounted and swept her into a warm embrace before turning to accept Thomas's enthusiastic hug. The boy had grown several inches during their time at the trading post, his frame filling out with good food and regular exercise. "How are my fierce warriors today?" Tacoda asked, his eyes crinkling with genuine affection as he studied their faces. "We learned about the Texas Revolution in school," Thomas announced proudly, "and about how different people remember the same events differently depending on which side they were on. An important lesson." Tacoda agreed, his eyes meeting Elise's over the boy's head. "Truth often depends on which side of the battle you stood on, and wisdom comes from understanding all perspectives." As the afternoon wore on, Tacoda shared news from the wider world. The conflict between white settlers and Indian tribes continued to escalate throughout Texas, and the territories with violence and betrayal occurring regularly on both sides. Treaties were made and broken with depressing frequency, and the pressure on native peoples to abandon their traditional lands grew stronger each year. "It will get worse before it gets better," he told Elise as they watched the children play together, their laughter echoing across the dusty compound. "But places like this give me hope. Here, children learn that differences in appearance and custom matter less than character and courage." "Will there be war?" Elise asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "There is already war, just not the kind that makes headlines in Eastern newspapers. It is a war for the future, whether this land will be shaped by hatred and fear or by understanding and cooperation." He gestured toward the mixed group of children. "Your students may hold the answer to questions their parents cannot even imagine." That evening, as the trading post settled into its nightly routine of shared meals and cross-cultural storytelling, Elise found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this place. She had lost her husband and her original dreams, but she had gained something precious in return, a new understanding of what it meant to build bridges between divided worlds. Murphy joined her on the porch of the schoolhouse, his pipe glowing in the gathering dusk as he surveyed his small kingdom of controlled chaos. "You've done good work here, Miss Barrett. The children respect you, their parents trust you, and even the government officials who come through speak highly of what we're accomplishing. That's not easy to achieve when you're dealing with folks who've been taught to see each other as natural enemies." "They're good children," Elise replied, watching a group of youngsters from 4 different cultural backgrounds collaborate on building a fort from scrap lumber. "Once you get past the surface differences, they're just young people trying to make sense of a complicated world. That's the truth of it," Murphy agreed, puffing thoughtfully on his pipe. "Too bad more adults can't see things so clearly. Of course, maybe these young ones will teach their own children better when the time comes." As if summoned by their conversation, Tacoda emerged from the trading post's main building where he had been meeting with Murphy about tribal matters and the complex web of relationships that kept their small community functioning. He moved with easy grace across the compound, his presence commanding respect without demanding fear. "The children are asking for a story," he told Elise with a slight smile. "Something about brave warriors and wise teachers, apparently. They've heard that story already." She protested, though she was already rising from her chair. "Stories worth telling are worth repeating. Besides, each time we tell it, we understand it a little better ourselves." They gathered the children around the fire pit in the center of the compound, the flames casting dancing shadows on their eager faces, as the desert sky darkened to reveal the brilliant tapestry of stars that few city dwellers ever saw. Elise began the tale, as she always did, with 3 desperate refugees stumbling across the desert, pursued by men who wore false faces and carried hatred in their hearts. But tonight, as she spoke of courage and kindness, of promises kept and bridges built between different worlds, she realized that the story was still being written. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities, new chances to choose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict. Thomas and Mary sat close to Tacoda, their young faces glowing with pride as they heard again how their mother had fought beside a Comanche warrior, how she had chosen to see him as a man rather than a monster. The other children listened with rapt attention that spoke to their understanding that they were hearing not just entertainment, but lessons about what was possible when people chose courage over hatred. As the evening drew to a close and families began to drift toward their homes, some teepees, some adobe houses, some canvas-covered wagons that served as temporary dwellings, Tacoda pulled Elise aside for a private conversation. "There is something I must tell you," he said, his voice serious in a way that made her stomach clench with worry. The army is planning a major campaign against the Comanche bands that refuse to move to reservations. My people may have to retreat deeper into the territory away from places like this. Elise felt her heart skip a beat. What does that mean for us? For the trading post and the school? It means that the bridge we have built here may not survive the storm that is coming. It means that you and your children may have to choose between safety and principle, between the easy path and the right one. And if we choose principle, then you stand with us knowing that it may cost you everything you have built here. His eyes searched hers in the firelight. I will not ask you to make that choice, Elise. You have already given more than anyone had a right to expect. Elise looked around the trading post at the simple buildings that housed families from different worlds, at the school where children learned that differences could be strengths rather than weaknesses. She thought about the promise she had made in a moment of desperation and how it had grown into something deeper, a commitment to truth and understanding that had become the foundation of her new life. I made you a promise once, she said quietly but firmly. To see your people as human beings, to teach my children the same. That promise doesn't have conditions or an expiration date. Tacoda's smile was worth all the uncertainty of the future. Sarah would have liked you very much. She believed that some promises are too important to break, no matter the cost. Then we'll face whatever comes together, Elise said with conviction. All of us, white, Mexican, Comanche, Cherokee, and Apache, that's what families do. 1 year later, when the army did come with orders to clear the area of hostile Indians, they found Murphy's trading post transformed into something unprecedented. In frontier history, a legally incorporated town with elected officials representing all ethnic groups, a school chartered by the territorial government, and a treaty of mutual protection signed by representatives of 5 different peoples. The soldiers, expecting to find a den of renegades and Indian sympathizers, instead discovered a functioning community where former enemies had learned to live and work together productively. Children played games that mixed traditions from different cultures. Adults conducted business in multiple languages with remarkable efficiency, and disputes were settled by councils that included voices from all represented groups. The commanding officer, a young lieutenant fresh from West Point, with textbook knowledge but no practical experience, was so bewildered by what he found that he sent for his superior, rather than risk making a decision that might anger powerful interests on multiple sides. When the colonel arrived 3 weeks later, he found a delegation waiting for him that included Murphy, Ayanna, Elise, and representatives from the Mexican, Cherokee, and Apache families. We are American citizens. Elise told him, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment and everything that hung in the balance. We pay taxes to the territorial government, follow federal law, and contribute positively to the regional economy. Our children learn English and American history alongside their traditional cultures. We are not harboring fugitives or planning rebellion. We are building the future. The colonel, a pragmatic man who had seen enough frontier violence to appreciate peace when he found it, studied the community's carefully maintained records and spoke with residents from all backgrounds. What he discovered was a level of cooperation and prosperity that defied everything he had been taught about Indian-white relations. Rather than forcing the community to disperse, he made the decision that changed everything. He recommended that the settlement be designated as a model for future Indian-white relations, a place where cooperation could be studied and potentially replicated elsewhere. 10 years later, the town of Esperanza, a name chosen to honor the Spanish-speaking families who had been among its first permanent residents, had grown to more than 1,500 people. The school had expanded to include a teachers' college that trained educators specifically in multicultural instruction, and graduates were spreading the community's model of inclusive education throughout the frontier territories. Elise, now serving as the school's principal and the town's elected mayor, stood in her office reviewing applications from prospective teachers and community members. Outside her window, she could see Thomas, now 16, and nearly as tall as his stepfather Tacoda, helping to train horses using techniques that blended Comanche wisdom with European methods. Mary, 14, and already showing signs of the beauty and intelligence she would carry into womanhood, was teaching a group of younger children the intricate patterns of traditional beadwork, while explaining the mathematical principles underlying the designs. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Tacoda, now graying at the temples, but still commanding in his presence, holding an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal. News from the capital, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, with the easy familiarity of family. The governor wants to use Esperanza as the model for a new Indian policy. Instead of forcing tribes onto reservations, he's proposing a system of incorporated communities where traditional and modern ways can coexist. Elise felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension as she read through the proposal. That's wonderful news, but it also means we'll be under much more scrutiny. There will be officials coming to study our methods, politicians looking for ways to use our success for their own purposes, and opponents who would love to see us fail spectacularly. Are you worried? Tacoda asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Tacoda was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving to the window where children from half a dozen different backgrounds played together in the schoolyard, and their games a seamless blend of traditions that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. I have learned that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. This place, these children, the future we are building together, they are Sarah's legacy as much as mine. And Esperanza will survive whatever political storms come our way. Elise said with quiet confidence, born of experience. We've built something stronger than politics or prejudice. We've built genuine understanding between peoples who were taught to hate each other. That evening, the entire community gathered for what had become a monthly tradition, a shared feast where families from all backgrounds contributed dishes from their cultures, creating a celebration that honored diversity rather than fearing it. As Elise watched her neighbors laughing and talking together, switching easily between languages and customs as naturally as changing clothes, she marveled at how far they had all traveled from their starting points. The promise she had made to Tacoda in a moment of desperation had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. What had begun as a simple plea to see his people as human beings had become a working model for how different cultures could not just coexist, but thrive together in ways that made each stronger than they could have been alone. Thomas approached her table, his plate loaded with tamales, fry-bread beef stew, and wild rice, a combination that perfectly represented the community's blended heritage and his own sophisticated palate. Mama Uncle Tacoda says there are newspaper reporters coming next week from back east to write about our school and how we've organized the town. That's right. Elise confirmed, noting how naturally her son moved between the formal English required for official business and the more relaxed mixture of languages used in daily community life. People in Washington and other places want to know if what we've built here can work in other locations. Do you think it can? Mary asked, joining them with her own eclectic meal and the serious expression that made her seem older than her years. Elise looked around the gathering, seeing former enemies sharing food and stories, children who had never known hatred because they had been taught from birth that differences were gifts rather than threats. Adults who had chosen cooperation over conflict, despite everything in their experience that said such cooperation was impossible. I think, she said slowly, choosing her words with care, that any place where people are willing to keep their promises and build bridges instead of walls has a chance to succeed. The question isn't whether our model can work elsewhere, it's whether people are brave enough to try something that challenges everything they've been taught about human nature. As the evening wound down and families began to drift toward their homes, Tacoda joined Elise on the school porch, where they often sat to discuss the day's events and plan for tomorrow's challenges. Together, they watched the children help clean up the feast, working in mixed groups that formed naturally without regard to ethnic lines or family origins. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine curiosity. Giving up your original dreams of California for this life? Elise considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked something of importance. She thought about the woman she had been before that desperate day in the desert. Narrow in her views, limited in her understanding of human possibility, carrying prejudices she had never examined or questioned. She thought about the life she and James had planned in California, the conventional path they would have followed among people who looked and thought exactly like themselves. No, she said finally, her voice carrying absolute conviction. Those dreams belonged to someone who didn't understand what was possible when people choose to see each other clearly. This life, this community, these children, and they're the dreams I never knew I could have. And the promise you made to me is the most important thing I've ever done. Not just because it saved my children's lives, but because it taught me what it means to really see people, all people as they truly are, rather than as stories and prejudices paint them. Tacoda nodded his eyes, reflecting the satisfaction of a man who had found purpose in the midst of profound loss. Sarah used to say that the best promises are the ones that change us as much as they change the world around us. She was a wise woman. I wish I could have known her. You would have liked each other. She believed, as you have proven, that understanding between different peoples is not just possible, but essential for survival in a world where the old ways of thinking no longer serve anyone's true interests. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge over the desert that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, Elise reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and purpose. A desperate promise made in the face of death had become the foundation for a new kind of community proof that understanding between different peoples was not just possible, but essential for building a future worth living. The promise had been simple in its original form: to see human beings instead of enemies, to teach children that courage and kindness could wear any face to build bridges instead of walls between communities that had been taught to fear each other. Its fulfillment had transformed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they touched, creating ripples of change that would spread far beyond the borders of their small town. In a land where different worlds had historically collided with devastating results, they had built something unprecedented, a place where the promise of equality and understanding was not just spoken as empty rhetoric, but lived every day through countless small acts of mutual respect and cooperation. It was a promise kept, a bridge built to span the deepest cultural divides, and a testament to what was possible when people chose hope over fear, courage over hatred, and understanding over the willful ignorance that had caused so much unnecessary suffering. The desert wind carried the sounds of their settling community, children's laughter fading into sleepy murmurs, adults calling goodnight to their neighbors in multiple languages, the gentle sounds of a place where people had learned to live in peace despite their differences. It was the sound of a promise, fulfilled, a future secured through hard work and mutual dedication, and a dream made real through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing to see others as they truly were, fellow human beings, deserving of respect, understanding, and love. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the stars, but it no longer sounded like a harbinger of danger and death. Instead, it was simply another voice in the desert chorus, no more threatening than the laughter of children or the whispered conversations of parents tucking their families safely into bed. The desert itself had not changed, but their relationship with it had been transformed by understanding and adaptation rather than fear and conflict. As Elise finally rose to go inside, she paused for one last look at the community spread out below her, lit by lanterns and cooking fires that cast warm pools of light in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did on the frontier, but she faced them with confidence, born of experience and the knowledge that promises kept in good faith had the power to change the world, in ways both small and profound. The schoolteacher who had once begged a Comanche warrior to save her children had become a leader who saved communities by teaching them to save themselves through the radical act of seeing each other clearly. It was a transformation that honored the memory of her husband and the wisdom of Tacoda's wife, Sarah, and the endless possibility that lived in the hearts of children who had never been taught to hate. The promise was complete, but its legacy would continue for generations yet to come.